everybody, and welcome back to Pastor Life Podcast. I am one of your hosts, David Brown. I am a Pinnacle Leadership Associate and the pastor of the Welcome Table here in Rock Hill, South Carolina.
And I'm Rhonda Blevins. I'm the pastor of Chapel by the Sea in Clearwater Beach, Florida, and a Pinnacle Associate and the co-host of Pastor Life Podcast with my friend David Brown, who is offering the content for this season of Pastor Life that we're calling Holy Experiments, Strategies for Joining God's Mission in the World. David, I know that you've had passion about this concept of holy experiments for a while now.
Yeah, it's really been something that as I was working with churches around Mark's making the shift process, it really became kind of a central part of what I was thinking about and doing with churches. And so then I've been able to really read and think and dive into this topic. In the last 2 years, I've had the opportunity to teach a Doctor of Ministry course at Duke Divinity School. And that's really just provided one more opportunity to sort of dive into this content. So, last week we talked a little bit about the context for holy experiments, the beginning and the ending, what's the point behind this, and kind of keeping the telos, the work of God toward a completion, toward making all things new, as the guiding light that calls us forward. And today we'll talk a little bit about seeing more clearly.
Well, I'm looking forward to learning from you in this episode of Pastor Life Podcast, Holy Experiments, Strategy for Joining God's Mission in the World. So David, as we get started today, seeing more clearly, can you kind of tease out a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, sure. So it seems to me that before we dive into strategic thinking or strategic doing, it's important that we're seeing ourselves and seeing one another and seeing the world as clearly as possible. And with our human brains, that can sometimes be a challenge. And so I think that starting with this idea of how can we see as clearly as possible what is going on around us and even within us is a pretty important thing before we actually get into the mechanics of holy experiments or of thinking and doing strategically within the church.
That makes sense. I think as individuals, there are stories that we tell ourselves, narratives that we kind of cling to. And as church communities, we do the same thing. And so, kind of learning to see what's the story that we're telling ourselves versus what is reality and how far apart are those two things. I think that might be really important before really diving into strategy. So as we kind of move into this content a little bit more, why don't you, maybe set some context for us and help us think theologically about this?
Yeah, I would actually probably start with a Bible story. Let's go back to the Gospels and this guy named Jesus. And there's a story that I think will be familiar to you and to our listeners from Mark chapter 8. Where Jesus encounters a blind man in a town called Bethsaida. And if you remember this story, it's the story where Jesus takes him aside. People have asked whether Jesus could heal him, and he takes him aside and he spits and he rubs saliva on the guy's eyes. And in the story from the Gospels, the man then can see, but he says, I see people, but they look like trees walking around. And so Jesus gives it a good second try and lays his hands on the man's eyes again. And the way that Mark says it, he says, the man looked intently and his sight was restored and he saw everything clearly. So I think a lot about this, that if we're not thinking about our own thinking, and if we're not really paying attention to what we're looking for and what we're seeing in the world, we can kind of be like the man in the story after the first touch of Jesus. We're sort of seeing things, but we're seeing objects. We're not really seeing the full picture. And maybe we're in need of sort of that second touch from Jesus. And we can dive into a little more about what that looks like in terms of what we know about our brains and how they function, and some of the the shallow end of the scientific pool that I have a little bit of knowledge on. So, but I think that story from Scripture is a great place to start.
It's interesting. Of course, you know that I've been kind of neck deep in Enneagram studies over this past year, a couple of years. And, the big work that we do in the Enneagram world is this noticing what's happening, noticing how we're feeling, thinking, you know, um, thoughts, feelings, physical sensations, right? And so I think there may be a little overlap in what we're talking about in our two worlds, so to speak. This noticing. Suzanne Stabile has this acronym she uses. It's called SNAP.
Hmm.
So stop, notice, ask, and pivot.
Huh.
SNAP. And so it's kind of the similar to what you're talking about, that
Yeah.
congregations, as we're talking about strategic thinking, should possibly snap, stop, notice, ask, and pivot.
That's great. I really love that. I had not heard that, but what a great thing to bring to this conversation. And I think you're right on with the idea that any tool and or process for self awareness, for knowing more about ourselves, for being more mindful or intentional, I think can really help in this process. Because the truth is that the way that our brains work is that we are making sense every second of so much material, so much
Yes.
information that's coming at us from the physical world around us. And our minds have to create roadmaps or models in order to process all of that and make sense of it. If we were truly absorbing every detail of the world around us, it would almost paralyze us. And so our brains do make these mental maps or heuristics. There's sort of rules of thumb, shorthands that help us to actually deal with all of the information, whether it's about the physical world, whether it's about the person who's standing in front of us, or some sort of relational interchange that's happening, or even whether it's something that's going on within our own body. Like our brains don't fixate on the fact that our heart needs to beat again in a
Right.
second. So we are constantly creating these mental maps of the world, and then we're using those maps to see and interpret the things that we encounter from day to day.
Yeah. So I think of the old hymn, "Open our eyes, Lord."
I
Right?
want to
Just
see
let's
Jesus. Is that how it goes?
yeah,
I don't
yeah, yeah,
remember how it goes.
yeah.
Well, and I mean, when you think about it, how often does Jesus say something about how are you? Uh, there's the blind leading the blind, or there's the blind person who sees more clearly than the Pharisees. And Jesus is always talking about those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. And well, don't all of us have eyes and don't all of us have ears? But Jesus is saying something about the intentionality behind what we see, and the care that we take, or the fact that we stop and notice. And I think you see that in other places in Scripture too. Two of my favorite stories about this sort of thing are Moses's call narrative, where he sees the burning bush, the bush that's burning but not being consumed. And I've always sort of wondered, how many people passed by that bush and just thought, oh, it's another wildfire.
Yeah.
Um, But Moses stopped and noticed that the bush wasn't being consumed. And that became the window into God's call on his life. Um, the wise men, the magi are kind of that way. How many people had the opportunity to notice a new star on the horizon? But they stopped and noticed and acted, right? So I think this first step of, if our minds are constantly mapping out the world and then using those maps to interpret the world, then we really run into problems if our maps are incorrect. Um,
Right.
and so one thing that I would say we can remind ourselves of is that number one, the map is not the territory. The map is not the territory. And so, if you were going out for a hike and you have a trail guide and it's a topographical map, you can look at that topographical map and you can have an idea of how the trail is going to wind. You can have an idea of how close or far away from water you're going to be. You can even have an idea, if you get used to using that kind of a map, of what the elevation change is going to be. And you can look at those topographical lines and almost imagine mountains or valleys. But the map, no matter how well we understand the map, is not the territory itself. It can't
Right.
substitute for walking through the woods, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
I think if we understand that we're making these mental models and that sometimes those models can mislead us, they can oversimplify, they can cause us to ignore certain things, they can cause us to only see the things we want to see. Um, Basically, this is what a cognitive bias is. This is, something that triggers within our processing system that causes us to overlook critical information or to not map out the situation correctly, to stereotype, or really to just misunderstand the world around us.
Right. So when it comes to strategic thinking for joining God's mission in the world,
Yeah.
are there like tools? Are there certain tried and true ways that we can do this work of stopping and noticing and kind of making sure the stories that we're telling ourselves are aligning with reality?
Yeah, I think you've really kind of alluded to one of them already, and I think it's awareness.
Right.
It's having that acronym, that SNAP acronym in your mind. Um, and really, these are all techniques, I think, for metacognition.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
metacognition is thinking about our thinking. So, typically we would um, move through life, and as human beings, we're constantly thinking and processing, engaging with the world around us, but we're not always thinking about how we think.
Right.
And so creating space in our life where we're actually accessing our own thinking, our own ways of thinking, sort of acknowledging that we do in fact have these mental models. I think just being aware of them, being aware of their limitations. So this is really about kind of self-awareness, thinking about our own thinking, and trying to be more explicit about the stories that we're telling
Mm,
ourselves.
right.
Being more conscious of the way that we are viewing the world through a particular lens.
It occurs to me that maybe in this moment, maybe I'm just slow on the uptake, but that metacognition is a psychological way to say the same thing that I've heard spiritual teachers like Richard Rohr, one of my favorites, and others, that we engage our inner observer,
Oh yeah,
right?
yeah,
And so, yeah, we're engaging the inner observer, which makes us pause, stop, and notice. And so, I guess metacognition is a psychological term.
yeah, yeah,
In what you're
and
saying, yeah.
maybe inner awareness or something
Hmm.
like that would be a spiritual or theological cousin or parallel.
Yeah. Yeah. So if we're activating metacognition, turning on the inner observer, if you will, um, and we're becoming more aware, then what?
Yeah, so I think another tool in the toolbox is similar to, but I think actually extends the idea of metacognition, and that's
Hmm.
empathy. I think empathy is
Okay.
something that we talk more about these days, maybe hear more about these days. But to me, empathy is really cultivating a deeper understanding of other people's thinking and or feeling.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, so
Yeah.
metacognition is really kind of thinking about our own thinking and the maps and models we're making, the stories we're telling. And then empathy would be becoming more aware of the stories other people are telling, the
Right.
lenses through which other people are seeing the world. And I think there are a number of different benefits to cultivating empathy. I think it eliminates the gaps in our thinking if we can realize that other people think quite differently from us. Um, I don't know. You might have something to share on this idea of empathy, but I think before I went off to college, I think I mostly thought that everyone's family pretty much functioned the way that my family did.
Right.
And then you get a roommate in college and you're spending a lot of time with people who grew up in different spaces and with different stories. And you realize, wow, there are people who experience the world in quite different ways than I did and that my family did.
Yeah. So, I mean, I hadn't really thought about the idea of empathy when it comes to strategic thinking, particularly when it relates to congregations and groups of people. But when we gather people together in like our consulting work that we do through Pinnacle, um, to help them hear and maybe even understand one another's perspectives, that's absolutely engaging empathy. That we're discovering something and finding our place of compassion for other people's perspectives and different stories that they tell themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of the interesting things that I learned in doing some research around this is that there's some basic level of empathy that is hardwired into all of us as human beings. And
Evolutionarily, I imagine, right?
evolutionarily,
Yeah.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
not, yeah. I mean, I think we can layer over this sort of a faith story that says, as human beings created in the image of God, we're created for relationship and, all of this. But,
Right.
but just from the evolutionary standpoint,
Mhm.
um, as scientists have had tools to sort of map our brain activity, um, there have been studies that show, when I pick up a ball and hold it in my hand, all sorts of neurons start firing in my brain. And they're neurons that are related to what I might do with this ball, how my arm might move, what muscles would be needed to throw the ball, all of those sorts of things. Well, scientists have also found that when I see a person pick up a ball, all the same neurons begin firing in my brain as if I had that ball in my hand.
Oh, interesting. Hmm.
And so there is some sort of basic connection, some sort of basic understanding that we have of what's going on in another person's thinking and feeling. But the key to this is that basic level of empathy, I think, has to be trained and nurtured and developed. Empathy for those people who are different from us comes much less naturally than empathy for people who seem more similar to us.
Right. I mean, it is a developed skill, if you will.
Yeah, I think that's
Um,
right.
I mean, yeah, to a large degree, anyway.
Well, and I think that each of these, when we think about the heuristics that our mind is naturally creating, the mental shortcuts that our brain are creating for good and for ill, that can help us to process everything that's coming our way, but that also may oversimplify or mislead. So our mind is constantly doing that. mental mapping naturally. Um, these things, metacognition, empathy, these things um, are things that we can intentionally cultivate
Absolutely.
that
Yeah.
that I think can at some level help us to deal with the ways that heuristics and mental models don't let us see as clearly as we could.
Mhm.
Um, and I would say this too with empathy. Um, we say, well, maybe we don't think a lot about empathy when it comes to strategic thinking or doing in the world. But empathy has become sort of a key first step for a whole area of thinking called design thinking.
Okay.
We're going to talk about that in a future episode, this idea of design thinking. But empathy is kind of step one for a design thinker. You're trying to empathize with the person, say in the business world, you're trying to empathize with the person who will be on the receiving end of your product or service. And that's the starting point for creativity and design work. So,
Okay. Yeah. Interesting.
so
Well,
there's
as
one
far as
other.
okay, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say if you've got more on empathy, we'll go there. Or
No,
there's
that's all
one
right. We're
other.
good.
So one other tool in the toolbox is creativity. Um, so creativity, sort of an imaginative spark, a
Yeah.
spark that would help us to see new possibilities beyond just the models or the stories that we've been given or that we've told ourselves. So I think we can probably imagine some ways that this connects with our spiritual side as well, right?
Yeah, probably. I always think, when we're in our creative best, that's one of the thin places in our lives.
Yeah.
That's when we can be closest to our creator.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like, a central part of our image bearing as human beings is this idea of creativity, right?
Yeah, yeah.
The creator who created us and invites us to create in our own life and in our world. Um, so, I think creativity, uh, it when we practice creativity, um, which I think is not just something we do solo. It's not just something we do within our own mind or, lock ourselves in a studio or in a garage. You think of all the founding stories of businesses and things that, or even inventors, like, you know, Thomas Edison, holed up in some workshop somewhere, or the founders of some new tech venture who are uh, building computers in their garage. Um, really, I think creativity more often probably happens in community. I think about this podcast, right? When we get on here, we've got different perspectives, we've got different things we bring to the conversation. So, I think creativity is a communal spark. It's probably not as easy to put a finger on as metacognition or empathy, even. I think there's something a little mystical about it. There's something that does tie us to our creator. Um, but I do think it's the sort of thing where, there's something inherent in us that is imaginative and creative. And maybe we tend to lose that over time. I don't know. What are your thoughts about creativity?
Yeah, I was gonna kinda mention that, it seems like imagination is a first cousin to creativity, and the
Yeah.
word, the root word for imagination is what?
Yeah, that's right.
Image, right? See, and where we're talking about seeing more clearly.
Yeah.
In order for us to see more clearly, we have to invoke our imagination and imagine there might be another way to view a situation. Imagine a reality out there in the future somewhere that has not been realized yet that maybe we can strive toward or even attain. So, yeah,
Yeah.
first
Well,
cousins.
Yeah.
Listen, cousins.
And so to me, I think in our first episode, as we were trying to lay the foundation for Holy Experiments, we talked a lot about the beginning and the ending of our story.
Uh-huh.
Genesis to maps, those first
Yeah.
couple chapters in Genesis, those last couple chapters in Revelation, and how it situates us in this in-between space between a creation that God looked at and said was good, where God created us, human beings, as image bearers, invited to be a part of what God's doing in the world. And then the end point where God makes all things new. And so I think that's the context in which we do strategy. And then I think that seeing more clearly invites us to think about who we are as we do strategy. We are people created in God's image. We are people called to creativity. We are people called to empathy. And if we think more about who we are, if we spend time thinking about the way we think, then we're going to just see the world more clearly. We're going to not be sidetracked by those cognitive biases, which we can't really escape, but we can acknowledge. We're going to know we're not seeing the full picture, and we're going to draw people around us to be a part of the process that will help cover our blind spots, help us to see collectively more clearly than we can on our own.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I I mean, you've inspired me. I feel my creative juices flowing as you've been talking. I've been thinking about some things happening at my church and some things we're looking forward to. And yeah, so helping my people learn to think about thinking.
Yeah, I think it's a good, maybe we don't typically think about that as a role for the pastor, right? Um,
Right. Yeah.
and as we move through this whole series, sometimes strategy is not necessarily the thing that is top of our list as pastoral leaders. Um,
Right.
I think this is an opportunity for us to kind of redefine our role or the way we see ourselves, maybe the story we're telling about our own way of leading in our congregations.
Yeah.
Um, so if we as pastors are doing some of this work on metacognition, some of this empathy work, thinking about the stories we're telling ourselves, I think it's only natural for us to be doing that work along with and alongside our congregants as well.
Yeah. 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 Well, thank you so much, David. You've given me some food for thought and things I'll carry with me through the week until we record again. Do you have any final thoughts about seeing more clearly in this Holy Experiment season?
I think that we've covered a lot of things that we can put energy and effort toward, some things that we can do. If we think back to that story about the blind man in Bethsaida, it's Jesus's touch that really helps him to see clearly. And it takes 2 touches from Jesus, right?
Right. Right.
So it's probably a good reminder to us throughout this whole process of thinking strategically about what we do as the church, to remember that the touch of Jesus is a resource that we have and a transforming force that we have. It's not something we control, but it's something that we can receive and that can really transform our own thinking about the world. So
Yeah.
I guess there's an element of mystery there. So maybe we're giving people a few things that they can do, a few tools in the toolbox, and then maybe a reminder. Create space for receiving that second touch from
Yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah. That's good. And sometimes there are times when we're called to offer a second touch as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Second, a third, a fourth.
Oh my gosh. Right.
Right.
uh, well, thank you so much, David.
Yeah.
And thank you for listening to Pastor Life Podcast or watching.
And if you would like to engage more with this topic, we are going to have some good notes down in the show notes, some links to some of the different articles, scientific background kind of pieces that we've talked about. And you can find that. And you can find lots of other information about Pinnacle at our website, which is pinnlead.com. That's PINNLEAD.com. And I hope you'll engage with us in that way. Until the next episode, thanks so much for joining us. And Rhonda, it's been a pleasure to keep tossing these ideas around with you.